Welcome to the Tambellini Group's New Normal in Higher Ed. I'm Rachel Clemens, and joining me here today is Dr. Josie Alquist, who is an author, a speaker, a consultant, a faculty member. So she's sort of all things Dr. Josie. Welcome, Josie.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's great. It's great to have you here talking about something that I think is really applicable today, especially given where we are in the state of the world today and with our election, but in higher education generally. So you've literally written the book on digital leadership in higher ed, which was published earlier this year. And I haven't had a chance to read it fully yet, but there's a lot of great stuff in there. I suspect, though, that a lot of that was, researched and written before we got to this year and before COVID hit. So, can you tell us a little bit about the state of digital leadership in higher education up until this year?
Yeah, it's humorous that the major submission of the final submission was a couple weeks before we went into quarantine. I also was basically in quarantine the month of February to finish it, so that also is ironic. But I do still think it's super relative, even though I don't say the word pandemic and COVID. Maybe it'll be a nice reprise from having to hear all of those typical words in these times or things like that. But my research started actually in 2013. I started to see campus leaders show up on platforms like Twitter in really interesting and authentic ways. And I also found that students were really into it. They were excited and connecting. And that's just as an observer. So when I started my doctorate, I wanted to research that as like a beta test to see, well, what were the things that and especially it was vice presidents and student affairs, what were they doing? And that was really kind of the seminal research for the book that expanded to chancellors and all kinds of roles on campus. Because on the other side of it, I've always seen this. I mean, it's ironic in an election, right? Like there's definitely like team social leaders who are leaning in, who are willing to explore. And then we have another very strong camp that there's sometimes visceral reactions when I say a certain social media platform or suggest some kind of way that they would show up in digital spaces that just completely don't see themselves in those spaces. And so I hope the book and my work helps bridge that, especially like pulling some of the resistors over. And obviously with COVID, we've been forced into some of these tools. So one of the guiding principles for digital leadership is change. So we've been forced to change, right? So then the next test is going to be, well, does that actually stick after, whenever things go back to some kind of normal? Or this.
Sure, I love that. New normal, right? I love that idea of team social. And I'm really curious for those who were already in the team social camp, if that gave them some sort of leg up, in the midst of COVID, or have we seen more people joining the team social? I'm totally going to adopt have we seen more leaders really sort of lean into and embrace digital leadership and social media platforms because of COVID? What sort of changes have we seen as a result of the pandemic?
Well, for those that were already engaged and active, you already built up that credibility, especially if you want to connect with your current college age students who are like traditional age, who can read a digital room like Superman. Like they can tell if you aren't being authentic or you're just kind of speaking like a robot. And so they already went through those discernment processes of figuring out how to show up in digital spaces that felt authentic to them, but was also received by their community members. And so that also allowed them to pivot, I think, more quickly to video and doing live streaming or just figuring out ways that they could quickly interact with their community live. I think that's also a big digital divide, is how leadership sometimes defines accessibility in, well, a direct message is inappropriate, or I don't, like certain times they don't want to respond, and I completely get that, but our community is messaging us there with real issues. So we need to figure out new systems to strategize how we can, they're reaching out to us, just like, like we
Right.
create new offices and new support structures. Campus leaders are most likely going to need more support systems based upon, different access points around. I think that's the other place where I saw a huge gap, where if leadership was not comfortable showing up on video, and or the way that they would write, that fell flat. Whether if that was public statements about racial injustice to the latest update on whether campus was going to reopen or not. I think we have found humans want to be spoken to and from humans, not
Right.
bulletin boards. And that honestly is a huge shift from what we would see from presidents in the past.
Yeah, I think, and you talked about this really showing up in 2013, and I think there was still a lot of social media feeds for leaders that looked a lot like, I don't know, marketing PR sites, right? Here's a headline, here's a thing that happened, here's an event, but nothing that was really sort of personal. And so has that been a major shift?
We still see that. And I do think you can tell then that most likely that leader is given all control over to someone else. If we're not seeing any kind of what I call in the book personalization from, I especially think moments are really meaningful to share, whether if that is a selfie with your family or your dog, like losing its mind over, like a treat you just gave it, like these little things that happen in our lives, those are reminders of human, like it does humanize us. You might
Right.
forget, based upon your position title, you're very intimidating to an 18-year-old or to a mom who's never been to a college. So that's what that's the ROI, is those small little things we can share that don't honestly take a lot of time, but based upon how we define leadership in the past, some might like demote those types of moments, like, oh, that's being silly or unprofessional. So I mean, it's honestly just completely redefining what we need of our leaders, even
Is
before COVID.
there is there is there inherent risk? And I know I didn't prep you with this question, so I'm going to go off script here a little bit, but is there inherent risk for some leaders in that? And so I think about something that Jesse Stommel, I think is how you pronounce his last name, tweeted recently about him being sort of targeted because of who he is and his sort of personal situation. I think about women. I think about people of color. People from the LGBT plus community. So even though you're a leader and you definitely have some positional power because of that leadership, are there other elements that make that personalization more risky for some leaders than others?
I completely hear that. And even I tried to make the book and my work relate not to just the most executive positions. There's examples from mid-level and new professionals, and there also is levels of risk for them who don't have protections literally for their position.
Right.
And many times we've heard stories and research where they are put in line based upon speaking out their opinions in digital spaces. I think overarchingly, to be aware, within the industry of higher ed, knowing the campus culture of, state institutions, some private institutions, we tend to see, um, you know, professionals being asked to fall more into, I think, probably more conservative methods of how they can show up in digital spaces as far as expressing their views. And that goes from what they can put in their offices to, like can say on Twitter. There's one
Right.
example in the book, he gets a whole chapter, is Walter Kimbrell, who is known as hip hop president of Dillard University. And he was hired at an HBCU, Dillard, to be outspoken. Like that is his role. And also advocates and presses to other HBCU leaders, because within that context, they do need to be advocates, right? So it goes
Right.
both directions, that some positions you really do need to step out and maybe take that risk, versus others knowing within that context what you're trying to navigate around and how else that looks for you.
That makes
So there
sense.
is a variety of elements of navigation. It is not as simple as me saying, just show up on Instagram, because that's why also I wrote the book, because I don't think and that's also why I use the framework of leadership, because I don't think we have granted social media the complexity of what that really means for our lives and the decisions. I think we're talking a lot more about how it's impacting our mental health, which I think is so important, and the self-awareness required. But I also don't just say, again, sign up for Instagram, everything's going to go great, it's so simple. I think we actually need way more dialogue and strategy around it, because it is very complicated, and the layers that go beyond that, based upon what each of us bring from our identities, I think is critically important.
Yeah, that complexity we're definitely seeing play out in real time, like as we speak, right?
Mhm.
So what do you think the impact of this year, and the experience of the pandemic and COVID will have on campuses and on the future of digital leadership? Is it going to move from this kind of like nice to have, it's great that the hip hop president is out there, to, a complete necessity for leaders in higher education in the future?
Well, there's what I hope, and then also what I've been hearing,
Okay.
because I I'm working here in Los Angeles, not on a campus anymore. It's always been so important to me to stay tapped in. I mean, just like you are doing these interviews, I think that's why I did my podcast, and the way that I write my blogs is I'm always asking questions and hearing the real stories, and not just like thought leadership. So what I am hearing is that leaders are saying, this isn't, like, I don't know what I would do without being able to go live on Twitter or to do a Q&A on Instagram stories. Like, I can't imagine any other way, even though maybe that's the only way they can show up right now. Like, they have seen that value, and the hope is they're not going back. Of course, I think in anything in life, we need to have a well blended method of delivery, from a course to, like how you connect with students. And social is a tool that does require some experimentation, and it's still being social proofed in higher ed. So that's also why I feature so many leaders that I do, as I'm saying, see, they're doing it. Like, they're doing it over there too. And it's also not just one way to do it either. I
Right.
don't give a recipe in the book. Um, so we need to look out to other leaders to see, okay, I kind of like how they do that. I don't think that would fit for me, whether it's a platform or just what they share, and you get to customize what that looks like for you.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. I've been on Twitter for, I think, 11 years now, and it definitely took me several years to really kind of find the way that it worked for me. I stopped, I started, I had to kind of figure out my voice in that environment. And so that resonates. Do you think it looks different moving forward? Do you think that, our standards for digital leadership will look significantly different in the new normal? If we think, 3 to 5 now, what does that look like, do you think? Or what would you like it to look like,
Mhm.
maybe?
Well, I think what we know in higher ed, some things need to be institutionalized to be made part of the culture. And that might mean it's literally written down, like in job descriptions, that positions are created to support, campus leadership, or resources are invested for that. Because another research that I did is just having one campus leader who is active on your campus on social media is role modeling to the rest of the staff, potentially positive role modeling. Not to say that's how to follow it, but there is a relief that a resident director or an IT coordinator can look to if that is a way that they want to express their leadership. Because we call for role modeling and mentorship in all other scenarios, but okay, well, who are your role models for social media? And honestly,
Right.
most likely they're probably not on your campus. And so you can just observe them on social or reach out to them. Like I'm sure I DM'd you at some point and said we need to connect, right? And that's where especially if you're listening and you're wanting to make those connections, you can definitely do those in public spaces, but use the tools built into the platforms to get messaging directly. I think that really kind of takes connections to the next level.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I have so many stories of people who I have met first through social media who have become, sort of lifelong friends. We've met in person, we connected at conferences, but it all started through social media and through some sort of interaction there.
Yeah.
So I'm going to ask you, I guess, the final question. Besides reading the book, which looks great, and from what I've read so far is great, what other advice would you give to leaders who really want to, start flexing their digital leadership?
Well, I would say don't feel like you need to be an influencer or get it perfect or be an expert of a platform because I mean, I had to let that go. Like these tools change constantly. See yourself as an explorer, but get some support systems set up around you. If that is some of the technical skills and even I would say cultural nuances of platforms, there is a culture within Twitter and even multitude layers within that platform. And let's not even get started about TikTok, right? Like I need like my cousin to sit me down to share with, like she's a high school student, right? So it may actually be a family member that over the holidays, maybe you're like, okay, all my students and some staff are talking about this, like just tell it, right? Or maybe that is someone on your team. I think the other thing is, as you think about gaining comfortability, is using these tools as social listening. And formally, that is an actual method you could invest in to make better decisions based upon online conversations. But you could also just, like, let's say every morning and also going to like news sources and checking your email, or maybe at lunch you search hashtags on Twitter or conversations in certain digital spaces to hear what your community is talking about. Not saying that you have to act on it all. In the past, I would always encourage leaders to search the tagged location on Instagram because your students are probably tagging themselves in photos like at events or like celebrations, and that is just, you can only be in so many places and hear so many things. So see yourself as a social listener, like scrolling to have a better idea of your community. And then if you don't really have a strong relationship with your communications team and marketing, get to know them. They are such a solid resource for teaching, and maybe even some strategy for you. And then also, I have a course coming out if that's like, okay, I just need to dig in more beyond the book. It's called the Connected Exec course. If you love to learn like I do, that might be another resource, and you can keep your eyes on my website for that.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Josie. It's been great to learn more about digital leadership and the importance of being team social in this new normal. I look forward to talking to you next time.
Yeah, my pleasure.